American Academy of
Okay,
Pediatrics.
good evening, Earth. This is Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Edge in Taos, New Mexico, working on oil painting Contact. Alright, tonight I am going to start in on the eye detail for the leaf scale eye tree with a light green, a medium green, gold, and then a red ochre. Basically, it's got a little gold in it too. But it's going to go from the light green to the medium green to the gold to the red ochre, and just the irises. So here we go.
Which would become a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. Because what they're saying is that the adaptations that children are forced to resort to in response to early stress help them endure that early duress and difficulty, but those same adaptations become source of pathology later on and even threaten longevity. Now that article came out just 6 years ago, but that's the perspective that I came to adopt or understand a long time ago in medical practice. Now, in order to understand the basis of that, we have to consider how we look at human beings, and how we look at disease. Now, Western medicine looks at disease from a particular perspective. And you have to understand something about medicine. It's science, all right, but it's also ideology. And there's a difference between science and ideology. There's a lot of science in it, and it's great science, but there's also ideology. And ideology is a point of view. It's the Germans say, it's a Weltanschauung. It's a world view that you're not conscious of. That you have hidden beliefs that you don't question. And people that question the hidden beliefs are seen as outliers or mavericks. And that's an ideology. And that exists in all realms, whether politics or science or medicine or history or economics or any field of human thought or investigation. So there's always ideological biases hidden in any system. And the logic of the system operates within those biases. Now, what are the biases of Western medicine? Well, the bias of Western medicine, and if any of your medical colleagues here want to disagree with me, I'll be happy to, although I doubt that you will, because I just think that if you're doing psychotherapy, you'll probably agree with me already. But maybe not. Well, the hidden biases are, number one, that diseases have either physical causes in the sense of genes or external forces like bacteria or viruses or toxins, or we don't know what the causes are. So the causes are either physical or the disease is what we call idiopathic. We don't know what the source of it is. So that's one bias, is that causes are purely physical. The second bias is that diseases happen to organs. So you have heart disease, and you have lung disease, and you have disease of the connective tissue, or the liver, or whatever. And then there's specialties designated to study in depth the diseases of these organs. But that, except for obvious lifestyle, so-called lifestyle proclivities like smoking or drinking, we don't really think that the life of an individual has a whole lot to do with the disease of the organ. So, cancer strikes somebody who doesn't smoke. We don't know what causes it. So we separate the organ from the whole person. And then we separate the person from the environment, so that the social environment, we might acknowledge the role of the physical environment, but we certainly not acknowledge the role of the social environment. So, in Western medical terms, the average physician would not be able to explain to you, this is not for lack of intelligence, simply for lack of training, would not be able to explain to you why is it that the more episodes of racism a black American woman experiences, the greater her risk for asthma. It's just a documented fact. Nor would the average physician be able to tell you very easily the multiple times documented fact that children whose parents are stressed are more likely to have asthma. As a matter of fact, the degree of the child's asthma has been correlated with the degree of mental disturbance on the part of the parent. So you go to the physician, you get the inhalers, but that's all that happens. And so, nor would, let me just give you another fact, which I won't explain now, but a study in Australia looked at 500 women with breast biopsies who were suspicious, or at least concern enough was raised that it should be malignancy or not. So they had these biopsies, and they also had a psychological evaluation. And when the results came back, it turned out that if a woman was stressed, that by itself did not increase the risk of lumping cancer, so there was zero effect. And similarly, if a woman was emotionally isolated, that by itself also did not increase the chance of developing cancer, so zero effect. But if a woman was stressed and isolated, the risk of developing cancers was 9 times as great as the average. And the researchers, being scientists, medical scientists, couldn't explain this one because they said, it's strange, how does 0 and 0 add up to 9? Well, that becomes clear. How 0 and 0 add up to 9 becomes very clear if you understand that human beings can't be separated from their environment. And what happens inside an individual on a physiological level is very much determined, or at least affected by what happens to them on a social level. So, nor would the average physician be able to explain to you, based on their training, why is it that if you look at lung cancer, the more adverse childhood experiences that you have, in other words, the more trauma you've experienced, the greater your risk of lung cancer, and this is true even if you cancel out smoking as a factor. Nor would the average physician be able to say a whole lot about the fact that a Canadian study showed that if you were abused as a child, your risk of cancer goes up by nearly 50%, and this is even after you've factored in or factored out things like smoking and drinking, which abused people are more likely to do. So these are the questions that we have to be able to answer. And it seems to me that any one of these facts that I just told you, which are not in question, ought to send the whole profession running to figure out what's going on in the correlation to physiology and emotions and our social existence. But we don't do that because we exclude this kind of information. That's the ideological bias. And so 70 years ago this year, there was a physician called George Engel who called for a different model of medicine. And he said,
darker green,
that the dominant model of medicine today, talking
still
almost
pretty
half a
bright,
century
but
ago,
slightly darker.
is biomedical.
I might go back
With
and
molecular biology, it's
add
basic
another layer.
scientific discipline. It assumes
Get the
disease to
shape
be
in
fully
first.
accounted for by deviations from the norm of measurable biological somatic variables. It leaves no room within its framework for the social, psychological, and behavioral dimensions of illness. The biomedical model embraces mind-body dualism, the doctrine that separates the mental from the somatic. And Dr. Norman Deutsch, who's a well-known psychiatrist here in Toronto, who writes on brain plasticity, he wrote similarly, just last year, modern scientific medicine has taken a fundamentally materialist approach, and it is analytical, meaning that it divides wholes into parts. It often proceeds by reducing complex phenomena to their more elementary chemical and physical components, viruses, genes, and molecules. So things haven't changed much since George Engel wrote those words, and what he called for was a biopsychosocial approach, which meant that the biology of human beings cannot be separated from their psychological and social environments. Now, at the same time, human beings have always known, we've always known that things can't be separated. So there's always been this tussle, you might say, between a unitary, holistic view of human beings and existence in general, and a dualistic view that separates things. So the Buddha said 2,500 years ago, he says, contemplate the interconnected co-arising of all phenomena. That's what he called it. The interconnected co-arising of phenomena. He said, look at a leaf or a raindrop. He says, and meditate. He says, meditate on all the conditions that are necessary for the existence of the leaf or a raindrop. So obviously, and it's trivially obvious, you look at a leaf, it contains the sun, the light, the photosynthesis, it contains the earth in the form of minerals, and it contains the sky in the form of water. So the leaf literally contains earth, sun, and sky. He says, the birth of any phenomenon, he says, is dependent on the birth of other phenomena. He says, without the many, there cannot be the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many. And that was the Buddha 2,500 years ago. And the wonderful writer, Susan Griffin, in her really transcendent book, The Course of Stones, wrote that the story of one life cannot be told separately from the story of other lives. Who are we? The question is not simple. What we call the self is part of a larger matrix of relationships and society. All the lives that surround us are in us. So that's the perspective from which I'll be conducting the discussion today. Well, I mentioned that I worked in family practice for 32 years, 12 of them with hardcore drug addicts, the other 20 in a straightforward family practice where I helped to deliver a lot of babies, and in palliative care where I helped a lot of people die and everything else in between. And in those years I found out the people who got sick and didn't get sick, they had certain characteristics that they surround us over and over again, so I just couldn't ignore it anymore. And there's a significant difference between an experience between a family physician and a specialist. In that the specialist certainly does know, and blessedly so, a lot about a certain organ and a certain system, but they don't know the patient.
That's a great one.
And by the time you see the patient's already sick, and usually they already have a diagnosis. At least we know what area the disease is. As a family physician, you get to see people before they get sick. So you know what their personalities are like for years before they get sick. And also you get to see them in the context of their families, including their multi-generational family of origin. By the way, just as an interesting exercise, let me just ask you right now, I'm not going to ask you any personal details, but how many of you in the last 5 years have been to a respirologist, a gastroenterologist, a cardiologist, a neurologist, a gastroenterologist, a dermatologist, maybe I said rheumatologist, any kind of an ologist? Just put your hand up. Okay, great. All right. Now, put your hand up again if they ask you about childhood trauma. One person. That's great. If they ask you about stress in your relationship with your spouse.
Was it so sometimes?
About
not bad.
job
15 minutes.
stress.
Okay, might be able to do this in 2
Yeah,
clips.
so we have maybe like a 5 to 10%.
Kind of going 2 by 2 to start.
To ask you about it. And
Imagine the next layer.
The discussion, but it doesn't even occur to them.
A little heavier. Maybe I should do that one
all
by
of you
3.
who went to these
Do
specialists
2 by
with
3,
everything childhood
and
trauma.
then jump like that. Or you can do this one by
Virtually
4
all.
and double it. Because
Now,
I think we're going to
that
need
you can't put into that category. And there are
more
genetic
bright
diseases,
green
like there's one that
balance.
runs in my family, muscular dystrophy.
Otherwise, the red
If
ochre's
you have
going
to
to take it over.
disease,
So yeah, let's do one more.
life or
This one more.
stress, it's
Maybe
just,
3
although
more.
that can affect the course of it, but whether you get it or not is simply genetic. Those diseases are extraordinarily rare. Like 1 in 10,000 of the population will have a disease like that. Most diseases have little or nothing to do with genetic factors. So these are then the patterns that I noticed in my clients. And by the way, when I say childhood trauma, probably some of you at least internally shaking your heads because you're looking at your life, and I never had any trauma. But I'll knock that out of you in half an hour or so. Okay. As a matter of fact, I conducted what I call the Happy Childhood Challenge, which I'll tell you about more later. Because it all depends on how you use the word trauma. And trauma, for me, and that's a whole other lecture, but trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. And things can happen inside you for which you don't need very dramatic events. But trauma essentially is a restriction of your capacity. It's a limitation, it's a constriction in the body, it's a constriction in your mental capacity to respond in the present moment from your authentic self. Essentially, trauma is a restriction of your authentic self in the present moment. That's what trauma is. For which you don't need dramatic events. So, what were these characteristics that I noticed in people with illness? I'll illustrate them by means of newspaper clippings from the Globe and Mail. The first one is an article written in the first person by a woman who's diagnosed with breast cancer. Her name is Donna, and her husband's name is Hai, and Harold is the doctor. And Hai's first wife died of breast cancer. Now Donna, the second wife, is diagnosed with the same condition. And you might think, what an unfortunate coincidence. Well, unfortunate it may be, coincidence is not. This guy, for a particular reason,
You said we had to go to 4 with this one? I think so.
It's that simple. What type of woman?
It'll start wrapping
Well,
in
here's
around towards
Donna's
the
description of
the
the diagnosis.
which I think would be good.
Harold tells me that the lump is small, and most assuredly not in my lymph nodes, unlike that of Hai's first wife, whose cancer had spread everywhere by the time they found it. You're not going to die, he reassures me. But I'm worried about Hai, I say. I won't have the strength to support him. Now, he was like a therapist. Noticed anything? So this, she's the one that's potentially facing surgery, radiation, maybe chemotherapy. And what is her first and automatic thought? How will I look after his needs? This will be so tough on him. He's already lost a wife to breast cancer. So this automatic and compulsive regard for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own is a major risk factor for illness, for reasons I will explain. The others are obituaries, also from the Globe Mail, from the Lives Lived column, and obituaries are fascinating because they tell us so much not just about the people who died, but also about what we as a society value. And often, and in every single case when I'm going to read you, is presented as a positive thing, as a good thing, which is why the expression "the good die young," they often do for reasons that should be clear to you by the end of this conversation. And these are the people for whose funerals, untimely deaths and funerals, hundreds of people show up mourning this wonderful person. So this man was a physician here in Toronto. He died age 55 of cancer, and the obituary said, never for a day did he contemplate giving up the work he so loved at Toronto's Sick Children's Hospital. He carried on with his duties throughout his year-long battle with cancer, stopping only a few days before he died. So, consider the scenario where a friend of yours is diagnosed with malignancy. Would you turn to them and say, hey buddy, here's how you deal with it. Go back to work tomorrow. And all the while you're undergoing treatment, never consider your life, never take a moment to see what's stressing you, never be alone and to deal with the reality of it. Just work every day until you drop. So this rigid and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the authentic self is a major risk factor for illness. As a matter of fact, any identification with anything outside of yourself is a risk factor for illness. The next obituary was written by a grateful husband whose wife died of breast cancer at age 55. And this spouse writes, in her entire life, she never got into a fight with anyone. The word she could say was foodie or something else along those lines. She had no ego. She just blended in with the environment in an unassuming manner. Now, I'm married to my wife Ray for 49 years almost now, and many times I wish that she would blend in with the environment in an unassuming manner.
Alright, so if that one was by 4,
as I'm sure you have,
roughly, first one was by 2, next one should be by 6, I think. That'll cut it through and behind. Oh, there's my head. Around and behind the blue jay, about to there. And then the red ochre will sort of circulate within the remainder. So, how much time we got? 7 minutes? Alright,
physiologically it does. When you repress anger, healthy anger, you're actually undercutting the activity of certain immune cells. This has been shown in the laboratory. I said healthy anger. And so we have to make a distinction between healthy anger and unhealthy anger, and I won't do that now, but be sure to remind me if I haven't made that distinction clear by the end. Unhealthy anger is rage. And in the aftermath of a rage episode, your risk of a stroke or a heart attack double for the next 2 hours, according to Israeli and American studies. Why? Because of course in a rage episode, you got real adrenaline discharge, which narrows your blood vessels, increases your blood pressure, can make the heart rate irregular and even clots the blood. So I'm talking about that's not healthy either. So we have a problem here. If you repress healthy anger, we get sick, and if we give in to unhealthy anger, we also get sick. So that's the third characteristic, is the repression of healthy anger. And the last one and the fourth one is illustrated in an obituary that you'll have to believe I didn't make up. It is from a Globe Mail. And this is from a physician, about a physician in Ottawa who died also of cancer at age 72. And it said here, Sidney and his mother had an incredibly special relationship, a bond that was apparent in all aspects of their lives until her death. As a married man with young children, Sidney made a point to have dinner with his parents every day, as his wife Rosalind and their 4 kids waited for him at home. He would walk in, greeted by yet another dinner to eat and to enjoy. Never wanted to disappoint either woman in his life, Sidney kept having 2 dinners a day for years, until gradual weight gain began to raise suspicions. Okay? And this is painted as a beautiful thing. Now, this man suffered from 2 fatal beliefs, and when I say fatal, I mean literally fatal. If you've got these beliefs, drop them today, if you can. If you can't drop them, find out why. One is that you're responsible for other people feel. Nobody's ever responsible for anybody else feels, unless you're a parent. Then you are. And secondly, that you must not disappoint anybody. So then, those are the characteristics. There's automatic concern and regard for the emotional needs of others while ignoring your own. Rigid and compulsive identification with duty, role, and responsibility rather than the authentic self or the needs of the self. Repression of anger. And the beliefs that you're responsible for how people feel and that you must not disappoint anyone. Now, the question is, how do these psychological behavioral characteristics translate into physical elements?
I had one that can't.
Before I go to the science of it, which has been fairly well worked out, and part of my critique of my own profession is that we just don't look at the evidence. So that we keep talking about evidence-based practice. But I'd love to expunge that phrase from the dictionary because it makes me grit my teeth. Because I only wish there was evidence-based practice.
Where'd you go?
I only wish that in the realm of child development, childhood conditions like ADHD, anxiety, depression, all kinds of mental health issues, physical health issues, I just wish we'd actually looked at the evidence. But we don't. This article I quoted you from Harvard wasn't published in some fly-by-night alternative publication. It was in a major medical journal. It's like makes no difference whatsoever. And the reason it doesn't make any difference is because of that ideological bias. That is an unwitting and unconscious ideological bias. It's essentially reminds me very much of Mr. Spock on Star Trek. Was the doctor, of course. He's from Vulcan, but they have no emotions, right? So when it comes to emotions, he says, that doesn't compute. Well, the unity of mind and body and the impact of emotions and of social relationships on physiology, literally, that doesn't compute in the medical mind. And that's why the research is just not incorporated into medical practice, despite the fact that it's been published and it's not even controversial. So let me illustrate my point with one particular illness that fascinates me because it's A, well known, B, has been the subject of a public campaign in the recent past, and 3, we say that we don't know what causes it, and 4, it's almost always fatal. And I'm talking about ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, known in North America as Lou Gehrig's disease. And it's a degeneration really of the nerves that activate the muscles that move the limbs and also our breathing apparatus and so on, so that people with ALS for the most part become paralyzed, in the end who have trouble breathing and die of respiratory failure. And it's almost universal, you can be fatal within 10 years, often much faster than that. Except when it isn't, as in the case of the physicist Stephen Hawking, who was diagnosed with it at age 21, was given 3 years to live and died 53 years later, just earlier this year. In the meanwhile, having become the greatest or the best known scientist in the whole world. Which ought to at least make us think that maybe we don't know everything. Not to mention other cases that have actually recovered from ALS.
Alright, just going to take a second take, and we only got 40 seconds left on this clip, so take 2 coming up.
Because she had been diagnosed with ALS.
Take 2.
And she'd been told that this would kill her, which it did within a year. But she wanted me to tell her, or actually more specifically her husband wanted me to tell her that it's not ALS, it's just stress. Well, I had to agree with the specialist, it was clearly ALS, but it was also stress. How the disease began is that she noticed that she couldn't hold the pen or the chalk in, she was a teacher, couldn't hold the pen or the chalk in her fingers anymore because it would slip through. So how she compensated for that, and she also began to experience trouble walking. And how she compensated for that was to get up early in the morning, like 5 in the morning, and of course it took her time to get dressed because everything was much slower and clumsier. And she'd get dressed and then drive herself to school, walk into the classroom with her somewhat troubled gait, and then grasp the chalk in her clenched fist and scrawl the day's lesson on the board for the students. Teach the whole day and repeat the performance the next day. And she did that for months, didn't ask for any help, didn't go for medical opinion until she could no longer walk. And that's when, well, it's an interesting dynamic as to why the husband didn't drive her to the doctor the first day. And that has everything to do with their relationship. And which is illustrated by the fact that after they saw me, and her condition worsened, and it became clear that she would not live, he started to have an affair with another woman, which shows you the relationship they had of his neediness. Anyway, they came to my office, and I had to confirm that this was the LS. But I started to talk to her about these patterns. Now, this is the kind of thing that physicians would say, with some legitimacy, this is anecdotal, doesn't prove anything. Well, I think anecdotes do prove something if there's enough of them. And it turns out that you'll never meet anybody, look after with ALS who's not like that. And this has showed up in no matter whose life I read about, no matter what patients I interviewed, my own case studies from palliative care, they were all the same. This difficulty asking for help, this refusal, this dogged refusal to ask for help. Then I looked up the medical literature, and there was a study done at Yale University Medical School quite some years ago now. In 1970, this article was published at Yale University Medical School. And what did these researchers find? They found that these patients invariably evoked admiration and respect from all staff who came into contact with them. Characteristic was their attempt to avoid asking for help. And, hard, steady work without recourse to help from others was pervasive. There seemed to have been a habitual denial, suppression, or isolation of fear, anxiety, and sadness. Most expressed the necessity to be cheerful. Some spoke casually of their deterioration, or did so with engaging smiles. And there was another study, which I won't quote to you now, which tended exactly in the same direction. And then I looked up the biography of Lou Gehrig. I knew nothing about the man except that he had this disease named after him. So as time passes, fewer and fewer people know about him, but he was a great baseball player, a teammate of Babe Ruth's of the New York Yankees in the 1930s. He was one of the all-time greats. He set a record for a number of hits by a Yankee that was only broken a few years ago. So it really was a durable record. But he set another record that wasn't broken for 70 years either. Is anybody enough of an aficionado to know what that record was? Anybody know what record he set? He never missed a game. Yeah, consecutive games played. And it's not that he was never sick. He got sick like everybody else. He just wouldn't take himself out of the game. It's not that he was ever injured either. At one point his hands were x-rayed, and it turns out that his fingers had been fractured something like 17 separate times. And his teammates would describe him as grimacing like a maddened monkey in agony as he fielded the ball with a broken finger, but he wouldn't take himself out of the game. And yet on the other hand, when a young rookie on the team got sick with the flu and couldn't play, and the manager was very upset with this young player, Gehrig says, "What are you talking about? He's got a flu, he can't play," and took the rookie to his own home where he lived with his mother. His mother put the rookie into Gehrig's bed. Lou slept on the living room couch while his mom nursed his kid back to health. It's just exactly, you never meet anybody with ALS who's not like that. Now, at this point the question comes up, are we blaming the person for the disease? Are we saying that they're responsible for their illness? The answer is no, and the answer is yes. No, we're not blaming anybody. Yes, they're responsible. But responsible here doesn't mean a sense of blame. It simply means that how they live their lives has a lot to do with their illness. The reason is, and not only that, if we're bringing a question of responsibility, we're actually empowering the client. You're saying that you've heard this version before of responsible as response-able. If we're not response-able, then what the heck are we? Then we're victims. So the whole idea is to make people response-able. And for that, they have to be responsible. They have to look at, well, how was I living my life? And how did that contribute to the illness? Why we're not blaming people, though, is because these patterns are completely unconscious. Nobody's aware of it. Nobody decides to be this way. What does it have to do with? Well, for that, you have to go back to childhood in every single case. So the woman with the ALS, the teacher, she was an adopted child. And shortly after the adoption, so you understand, any adopted child has got a deep sense of rejection and abandonment. That just goes with the territory. That doesn't mean we shouldn't adopt kids. It just means that that's a major factor that then we have to really help to heal. And then, shortly after the adoption, the adoptive mother gets pregnant. Now, what do you think the rest of the story is? The adopted child never believes, never perceives that she's loved and appreciated and welcomed and enjoyed like the biological child. And so she develops a coping mechanism. I'll take care of myself, just love me. I don't have any needs, just tolerate me. That's how she survives. Now, remember I quoted that article from Harvard, that those early coping mechanisms then become sources of pathology later on. Because those early coping patterns, here's the problem with them. They're meant to be temporary states. We're meant to adopt these patterns. I mean, if you're familiar with my idea of ADHD, which I've been diagnosed with, it's a coping mechanism of young infants. When there's stress around them and they can't escape, fight back, or change the situation, ask for help, they tune out as a way of coping. But then it gets wired into the brain and now goes from a temporary state, which is meant to be, to a long-term trait. And the coping mechanisms become problems when they go from state to trait. There's nothing wrong with her coping that way if she could drop it once she no longer needed to be that way. But of course, that's not how it works. These coping mechanisms are unconscious, therefore they're not chosen deliberately, therefore they cannot be released deliberately either. We're not even aware of them. The problem is that as children, we all face a dilemma. So before I explain the dilemma, let me ask a question. If you've had the following experience, just raise your hand please, that you've had an experience of a strong gut feeling about something, you ignored it, and you were sorry afterwards. Just raise your hands. Okay, thank you. There's one or two people that didn't put their hands up. Congratulations. That not listening to your gut feelings is already a disconnect from yourself. And you just told me the story of your childhood. Because the day you were born, you were connected to your gut feelings. At some point you learned not to be. But why did you learn that? For survival. So a child has two basic needs. The one need is for attachment. Now attachment is my friend Gordon Neufeld defines it, is the drive, is the biological, psychological, emotional drive for closeness and proximity with another human being for the purpose of being taken care of, or for the purpose of taking care of the other. So there's an attachment drive between parents and children. Between parents and children of any species, beginning with birds and upwards.
I suppose that's okay.
It's the biological drive.
Oh, for that. What do you think?
Being taken care of.
More snacks.
You can't live without it.
Idle on the
Least
cat.
of all, no creature beyond reptiles can live without it.
The level of cuteness I have to contend with.
Least of all to human beings, because they're the most
insists on eating until she horks everywhere and then asks for more.
So the attachment drive is very powerful in our brain, and it explains much of human behavior, virtually everything that you deal with in your offices.
Or anorexic. I think bulimic
related to disturbance of
attachments when you start. So anyway,
and a lot of the people that you see in
mental
offices,
disorders in my little kid.
their difficulties
We're working on
because they're still choosing attachment
Cowboys
over
big help.
authenticity, and attachment of any almost at any cost, and it's killing you on some level. So why do these patterns make you ill? Well, the reason these patterns make you ill is because it turns out that as traditional science, as traditional medicinal practices have always known, you can't separate the mind from the body. You can't actually separate the mind from the body except in medical school, but not in real life. I was in Fort Francis, Ontario for a couple of days earlier this week, speaking to mostly native audience, and there's the native medicine wheel, which is 4 quadrants of mind and body and emotions and spirit. And they say that for health, you have to have a balance between those 4 quadrants. And traditional shamanic medicinal practices, Ayurvedic medicine of India, Ayurvedic medicine of China, all the medicine men and women of traditional cultures have always assumed and known about the mind body. They just didn't have the science, but they knew it. Now we have the science, but we no longer know it. And so the science has been worked out. It turns out that the emotional centers of the brain are connected with, we should say the psyche, are connected with the nervous system, with the immune system, and the hormonal apparatus. And the science that studies the interconnectivity of these ostensibly separate systems is called psychoneuroimmunology, or more properly said, psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology, to include the hormonal ones as well. It turns out that it's not even that these separate systems are connected together, they're not even separate systems. They're one system with different manifestations. I mean, think about it. First of all, evolution begins with a single-celled organism. That cell then differentiates and becomes a multi-celled organism. But the basic functions of defense, nourishment, and survival have to be carried on by the organism. It's just that now you have different cells that are specialized in certain duties, so that some cells become digestive cells, other cells become brain cells, but they all have the same DNA. And even as human beings, we still begin with one cell, with the union of sperm and egg, and then we differentiate and we separate, but that doesn't mean we get disconnected. And so it turns out that the nervous system wires together all these systems. So there's a part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, which is the part of our nervous system that is not under conscious control, so it's autonomic, which is to say autonomous nervous system, you can call it, as opposed to the voluntary nervous system that allows me to snap my fingers if I want to. There's the autonomic nervous system, and that is what innervates our viscera, our heart, our guts, our lungs. It's responsible for the tension of our muscles. The autonomic nervous system connects the brain to the bone marrow, where the red and the white cells are manufactured, and it sends messages from the bone marrow to the brain. It connects the brain to the hormonal glands, to the immune organs, to the spleen, where the red cells are stored, to the thymus, where the white cells mature, and it sends messages from all of these organs back up to the brain. So there's a constant, so the nervous system is like a giant electrical grid that wires together all these systems. And the anatomical connections have been worked out. That's one form of connection. The other form of connection, of course, is through the hormones themselves. So the hormones from the hormonal glands in the brain, the pituitary and the hypothalamus, and then elsewhere in the body, the gonads, the ovaries, the testes, the thyroid gland in the neck, the adrenal gland on top of our kidneys, adrenal, top of kidney. These all also send secretions, hormones to other organs, and they have an impact on each other. They're constantly talking to each other. That's the second form of connection. The third form of connection is that each of these systems, including the immune cells, can manufacture messenger substances that are circulated through the blood to the other systems. So it turns out that the white cells in your circulation can manufacture every hormone that the brain can manufacture. So the brain is talking to the immune system, and the immune system is talking to the brain. So when something happens in one system,
oh shit,
it happens in the other system.
Trunk is stuck in the
But this is rather obvious, actually, when you think about it. It's just that the implications are not obvious to us. So I could clearly, trivially, obviously, change your physiology. I would change the physiology of virtually everybody in this room in a split second. And I can do so without touching you, without giving you any kind of a substance, without even physically interacting with you.
A little trickier.
What would I have to do? I simply would have to utter a piercing, blood-curdling scream and brandish a weapon.
Session for the section.
And your physiology would change like that. Your hormonal gland will start being differently, your intestine will stop digesting, your lungs will function differently, your heart will beat faster, your blood vessels will behave differently, more blood will flow to your muscles, there'll be more sugar pouring on your system so that you get more energy, and you'll be ready for flight. Now that's an obvious example, where the emotion changes the physiology in a split second. Well, guess what? That goes on 24/7. So that interaction between the physiology and the emotions is constant. It's just that for the most part we're not aware of it unless it's dramatic. But that's the only difference. It's no less constant and important. So stress in the short term allows us to escape or to fight back. And it's interesting, this conversation is interesting for specifically for Canadians because of two historical figures. One is the great physician, William Osler, whose name is still remembered. There are institutions named after him. And in Vancouver, they give a William Osler Memorial Lecture every year, and they never talk about anything he talked about. And so there's, and he's the one, he was knighted by Queen Victoria. He's one of the founding physicians at Johns Hopkins in the States, Baltimore, and of course he was also the leading
Damn, I
member
don't think
of
we'll be able to do that in 9
University.
minutes. That's what's left on this memory
And,
session.
he's the one who said
I'll run the
that
clock out.
arthritis
Do another
is a nervous
session.
system disorder. He said that before he had any of the science, he just knew it. And he trusted his intuitions. He also said that if I want to know whether or not a person will survive tuberculosis, I have to know not what's in his lungs, but what's in his mind. So there's him. He said that in the 1890s. And then a few decades later, from Austria-Hungary, comes a man known to us as Hans Selye, S-E-L-Y-E, or give him his Hungarian name, Hungarian like me, János Selye. And he's the one that did the research at the University of Montreal about stress in the laboratory, and he's the one that found out that stress in the short term, of course, helps us escape and fight back, but in the long term, it suppresses the immune system, ulcerates the intestines, and causes hypertrophy of the adrenal gland. This is Selye's famous stress triad. So the point is, short-term stress is essential for survival, but chronic stress, the same hormones of adrenaline and cortisol that in the short term help you survive, in the long term kill you. So adrenaline, which gives you more energy and strength to fight or to run, in the long term, will elevate your blood pressure, constrict your blood vessels, and dysregulate your heart. Now, there's a condition which is increasing in the population called hypertension, which is to say high blood pressure. And for the most part, about 5% of hypertension cases are secondary. In other words, they're caused by some disease in some other organ, like the kidney, for example, or the adrenal gland or something. But for the most part, we call it essential hypertension, which basically is a way of saying that we haven't got a clue what causes it. And what if I told you that the blood pressure of American black males is much higher on the average than that of whites, and are more likely to develop hypertension, much more likely to develop hypertension. Does that give any clue as to the source of hypertension? Maybe? As opposed to their genetic relatives in Africa who don't have high blood pressure at all. And all you have to do is say hypertension a few times, like hypertension, hypertension, hypertension. Anything spring to mind? Maybe there's too much tension in these people's lives. And of course, James Baldwin, the American black writer, famously said that to be an American black male is to live in a state of suppressed rage all the time. That's why the blood pressure. So in the long term, that's what it'll do. In the long term, cortisol will thin your bones, give you osteoporosis. Now, when the Osteoporosis Society does its public education, they talk about sunshine, vitamin D, and weight-bearing exercise. They never talk about stress, which is the most important cause. For example, women who are depressed are much more likely to have osteoporosis because in depression there's elevated cortisol levels, which thin the bones. Also, it's the intestines. And medical ideology is interesting. Ulcers were the one thing where doctors always knew that it had to do with stress. Until 3 or 4 decades ago, where an Australian, very clever Australian scientist found this bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. And now if you give antibiotics to wipe out the bacteria, the ulcer goes away. So there goes the stress theory, or it doesn't. Because here's a fact that you have to account for. At age 50, 50% of the population will have Helicobacter pylori in their intestines. 50% don't have ulcers. At age 80, 80% will. But 80% of 80-year-olds don't have ulcers. What is it that makes the person susceptible to that bacteria? That's the question. Guess what? It's stress. So that hypothesis wasn't wrong. It just that it had another wrinkle to it, that's all. But we're so quick to get anything that's emotional, we can get rid of it, we do, and then we go to, oh yeah, it's a bacteria. It puts, cortisol puts weight on your belly in a way that increases your chance of heart disease, and it suppresses your immune system. So let's go back to that Australian study. 500 women, 0 effect from isolation, 0 effect from stress, 9 times the average if you have both of them. Well, now let's look at stress. Let's say that you're stressed about something, and you've got high levels of cortisol in your system, and you're obsessing about some insult or a loss or something that could hurt you. You're in a high state of stress physiologically, but you're not alone, because a friend of yours sitting next to you says, hey, do you want to talk about it? I see that you're upset. Can you talk about it? What happens to your stress levels? But what if you're isolated? Then you might go on for months stewing in your own stress juices. You have nobody to download it to. No wonder then the women who are stressed and isolated had a much higher risk of breast cancer. Which tells us something, that cancer is not the disease of an individual. Cancer is the result of a biopsychosocial process reflecting your lifelong relationships with others. Yeah.
Do you think that we don't look at that piece because it can't be solved with a
Well, we can speculate on why we don't look at that piece. That's a part of it. In that, who funds research? Well, the people who fund research, and the vast majority of research that physicians run across or come across, are actually funded by the pharmaceutical companies who have a particular interest in research that validates their particular approach, which so happens to coincide with their profits. But that's only a part of it. It's much larger than that. If I have to speculate on reasons, the major ones are that it reflects capitalist ideology. Because capitalism is all about individual competition, everybody against everybody else. We don't want to think about the fact that we're all one, because if we're all one, this society makes no sense whatsoever.
All right, we'll do another take.
So,
Take
and
three.
every ideology of the dominant.
Take 3.
And that's the same true with doctors as well. So partly it's the materialist philosophy that dominates capitalist society. Individualism, not looking at the connections. I mean, if we looked at the connections, you wouldn't have had the election results that you did yesterday in Ontario. That's one thing. The other thing is that what I'm saying is difficult for people. People often perceive themselves as being blamed. They're not being blamed, but they perceive themselves as being blamed. And Dr. Christine Northrup, who's a women's physician and best-selling author, I was talking to her and she said that it's kind of a conspiracy between the doctor and the patient not to talk about such stuff. For the doctor, it's easier to hand out the pill and it's much quicker. And for the patient, it doesn't bring up uncomfortable questions. But the biggest barrier is actually an emotional one, I think, on the part of physicians. We haven't dealt with our own pain. We haven't dealt with our own stresses. There's a high rate of suicide and depression and burnout amongst doctors. Somebody once said that if you want to start a cult, what do? Well, you give people a uniform, you have special jargon, you isolate them from their families, you subject them to authority and leaders, and you sleep deprive them. In other words, you send them to medical school. It's a stressful thing. And people survive it by shutting, people enter it are like people like me, really driven. And you know, I would have done anything to get into medical school, to get through it. And so you really are already driven, and then nothing in education prepares you for it. Anything I'm telling you, not a word of this is breathed in any of the medical schools. And then there's the emotional defense of the physician against his or her own pain. So these are the factors that I think all go into it. They're social and individual. Now listen, before I take more questions, which I'll take lots of questions, I promise. I just want to finish this talk so that we can have our workshop and our conversation and so on. Let me tell you about stress. So there's the physiological, I've been telling you about the physiological stress response. The physiological stress response. But that's not all there is to stress. So stress is really a triad. There's 3 components to stress. One is the external stressor. Now, that's whatever happens outside you. So that could be a threat, that could be the loss of someone, the loss of a job. If you're a conservative voter, stress would have been the election of the NDP. If you're an NDP voter, stress would have been the election as it happened last night, which is the advent of Mr. Ford. So stress is external. Then there's the physiological stress response, which is what I already told you about. The adrenaline and the cortisol, all the immune. By the way, I didn't even finish telling you all the connections. I'm sorry. Let me just hold this thought. Let me tell you one more connection. The gut-brain connection. The gut is not just a digestive organ. The gut is actually an immune organ. It's got many immune centers. And the gut is an organ of sensation. Serotonin, the chemical in the brain that we enhance by giving people Prozac for their depression, the gut has more serotonin than the brain does. And so the gut is an emotional organ. Therefore, gut feelings are actually magnifications of impressions that the brain gets, and the gut amplifies them so they can really know that they're there. And the gut and the brain are totally connected. In fact, the gut sends many more nerve fibers to the brain, then the brain sends to the gut. And the brain is reading the internal organs all the time. So there's that connection as well. And there are others I'm not going to go into, but I think you receive the point that this is all one system. Therefore, whatever happens in one happens in the others. So stress then, there's the external stressor, there's the internal physiological response, and in between them, and this is what you've got to work with in your offices, is what we call the processing apparatus. And the processing apparatus is that person with their particular interpretations and their understandings and their beliefs. Now, I said I would tell you about healthy anger versus unhealthy anger, so let me just illustrate that for you now. I need another volunteer, somewhere in the side rows so I can have access to you. You're not going to leave your seat or do anything in particular. Yeah, you're volunteering, thank you. Okay, so I'll come closer to you, and what is your name? Kelly, thank you. Thanks for volunteering. So what I'm going to ask you is, how comfortable are you with the distance that you and I right now? If I give the rest of the lecture from here, is that okay with you? Perfectly all right. And what if I stood here? Oh, by the way, I gotta tell you the rules here, okay? In this particular exercise, that chair is your life. You can't leave it, okay? You can do whatever you need to in the chair, but you can't leave it. So, what if I stood here now? Are you still comfortable with this? If I give the rest of the lecture from here, is that okay with you? Yeah, okay, so what would you like to do about it? But you can't. No, no, this is your life, you can't. Yeah.
I'm gonna start coming
To move, you see, move towards me to get me out of your space. Very, very good. And if I came closer, what would you have to do? You have to push me, and as you're pushing me, what emotion do you think you'd be generating? Anger. Well, fear is there, but it's the anger that's going to get me out. Fear is not going to get me out of your space. It's the anger is going to. So that's the thing about healthy. Thank you. That's the thing about it. You don't know how many times I've done this, and people never get to the point of anger. They'll say, "I'll tune out. I'll make myself small." So that's a sign of health. That's it. The point is that healthy anger is exactly what Carey demonstrated. It's a boundary defense. It simply says, "You're in my space, get out." That's all. And it's in the present moment. Once I got out of your space, you have no more reason to be angry. If you went on, that guy's always doing it, they'll probably do it next week, what a guy, what a jerk, and that's no longer healthy. Healthy is simply, you're in my space, get out. It's a self-protection. In general, the role of the emotions is to invite in what is nurturing and welcome and healthy, and to keep out that which is unwelcome, dangerous, and toxic. That's the role of the emotion. So with some people, sometime will invite even greater proximity. And others we never want to be anywhere close to. And that's the job of our emotions, to maintain those boundaries. Now, trick skill testing question. What is the role of the immune system? It's exactly the same thing. It's to maintain your boundaries, to keep out what is unhealthy, dangerous, unwelcome, allowing what is nutritious and healthy. And the immune system has been called a floating brain. It has a memory capacity, it can react, and it can learn. Just like the brain. When you're suppressing your emotions, you're suppressing your immune system. And what happens to anger that you suppress? Does it evaporate, go to the moon? What happens to it? Who does it turn against? It turns against you. Now you've got autoimmune disease, where the immune system turns against you, like rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis. Hodgkin's is a cancer. So Hodgkin's is a response also to the suppression of the immune system, where the immune system is no longer protecting you. But in the case of autoimmune disease, the immune system actually turns against you.
All right.
I'll talk
That
about
gets it in.
fibromyalgia. In fact, we'll have a case of it.
Irises
Could have hold on.
set. Now we gotta do pupils and then redo the edges of all the eyes. Make them more
80%
pronounced.
of people
That gets the basic color blocked in this. That's nice.
women.
Alright. Wash my brush out. We'll wrap
The
this up.
ratio of multiple sclerosis, which is an autoimmune condition of the nervous system, in the 1940s in Canada was about 1 to 1. You know what the
Pupils
ratio
will be
is?
the real trick. Because you
About
gotta get them
3
dead
women to every
center.
man.
I guess some can be a little more dilated than
So
others.
3 women to every man.
At the end of the world.
Now what
Still
could
can be a
possibly
little
be the
tricky.
cause of it? Well, we know it's not genetic, because genes don't change in a population over 70
Alright, where's my
years.
rag?
It can't be the climate or the diet, because that hasn't changed more for one gender than the other. What has changed?
Alright.
The stress levels have changed. What has happened is that women have always had their role of being the stress absorbers of their families, including their spouses. Which is why married men live longer than unmarried men, but married women don't live longer than unmarried women. Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Alright, so as you can see, that gets a light green to a dark green to a gold to a red ochre. Iris coloration. Sort of gives a nice patterning and color shift, color variety to the tree leaf scale eyes. So that's it for the moment. Thank you for watching. That's Adam Sturch broadcasting from the Mushroom Mansion, Taos, New Mexico, working in oil painting contact.
Why is there less support? Because there's less connection, more
Get that
isolation,
even.
more erosion.
There we go.
of community,
Have a good night, Earth.
clan, family, and so on. So what do you got? More stress, less support, more autoimmune disease. It's really that simple. It's that simple. Except